A lonely farmer allowed a widow and her daughter to sleep in his barn for one night. At dawn, he was paralyzed when he saw what the woman was doing with her daughter behind the stable. Theodore's pickup truck kicked up dust on the dirt road as he returned from town with the week's groceries. The afternoon sun hit hard on the windshield, making him squint. He drove on autopilot as he always did on this route he knew by heart, thinking about yet another empty day awaiting him at the farm. Loneliness had become his only constant companion in recent years, since he lost his wife. The once thriving farm was now just a place where he existed, without real purpose, without hope that things would improve. Theodore sighed deeply, feeling the familiar weight of sadness tighten his chest. Just another day like all the others, he thought bitterly. That's when he saw something unusual by the roadside, about 200 meters ahead. Two small figures, one lying on the ground, the other kneeling beside. Theodore frowned, confused, and took his foot off the accelerator. It wasn't common to find people on this rural road, especially at this time. As he approached, his heart began to beat faster. The kneeling figure was a child, a little girl, and she appeared to be crying. The other person was completely motionless on the ground, and even from a distance, Theodore realized something was very wrong. He stepped hard on the brake, making the truck skid, and stopped just a few meters from them. A cloud of dust enveloped everything for a few seconds. Theodore felt a rush of adrenaline course through his body as he hurriedly opened the door. "My God, what happened here?" he muttered, feeling fear tighten his throat. As soon as he got out of the truck, the reality of the scene hit him with full force. The girl was at most 8 years old, dirty with soil and dust, her face marked by tears and despair. She was holding the hand of a woman lying on the ground, completely unconscious. The woman's skin was too pale, almost grayish, and even standing, Theodore could see she was burning with fever. Her body trembled slightly, involuntary movements indicating something was seriously wrong. Around them was an old, torn backpack, some rags that appeared to have been clothes and nothing more. The girl looked at Theodore with wide eyes, full of terror and pleading. She opened her mouth but could only sob. Theodore felt his heart break in that instant. "Easy, little one, I'm going to help you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic he felt growing inside. Theodore knelt beside the woman and immediately felt the heat radiating from her body. The fever was extremely high, dangerously high. He placed 2 fingers on her neck looking for a pulse and found a weak, irregular one too fast. The woman's breathing was shallow, barely perceptible, and her skin was dry like old paper. Theodore had seen animals in that state on the farm and knew it meant severe dehydration. He looked at the girl, who continued crying silently, clinging to her mother's hand as if that could bring her back. Both of their clothes were dirty and worn, their feet swollen and covered with blisters. It was obvious they had been walking for a long time, probably days. Theodore felt a wave of compassion and urgency take over him. "Is she your mother?" he asked gently, already knowing the answer. The girl nodded, unable to speak. Her small hands trembled as they squeezed her mother's hand. Theodore could see the absolute terror in her eyes, the fear of losing the only person she had in the world. He needed to act quickly, very quickly. Every second counted. Theodore jumped up and ran to the truck, opening the back door. His body moved on pure instinct, without thinking, just acting. He ran back and carefully but urgently slid his arms under the unconscious woman's body. She was too light, frighteningly light, as if there was nothing but bones and skin. Theodore lifted her in his arms and walked quickly to the truck, feeling the heat of her fever burn through his own shirt. Her head hung back, completely without strength. "Come on, little one, grab the backpack and get in the truck now," he told the girl, his voice coming out harsher than intended from the desperation he felt. The girl obeyed immediately, picking up the old backpack and running after Theodore. He laid the woman down on the back seat of the truck with as much care as possible, resting her head on his own rolled-up jacket. The woman didn't react, didn't make any sound, remaining in that frighteningly motionless state. Theodore helped the girl climb up and sit beside her mother, and she immediately resumed holding her mother's hand. Tears continued to stream down the child's dirty face, leaving clean trails in the dust. Theodore ran to the driver's seat, started the engine and stomped on the accelerator, making the pickup truck race down the road. Rocks and dirt flew in all directions as he drove at the speed limit, ignoring potholes and speed bumps. His heart was racing in his chest. "Hang on, just hang on a little longer," he muttered, not knowing if he was talking to the woman, the girl, or himself. The road to town never seemed so long. Theodore exceeded the speed limit without caring, honking when necessary, swerving around other vehicles. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He constantly looked in the rearview mirror, checking on the woman in the back seat. The girl had bent over her mother, whispering things Theodore couldn't hear, but could imagine. Pleas, prayers, words of love and despair. The scene was heartbreaking. Theodore felt tears burning his own eyes, but blinked hard to push them away. He needed to focus, needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. With each passing minute, that woman's situation worsened. He could feel it. It was like a race against an invisible clock that was almost out of time. "We'll make it. We'll get there in time," he repeated aloud, trying to convince himself. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was only 15 minutes, Theodore saw the first houses of the town appear. He accelerated even more, ignoring traffic signs when he saw no one was around, honking to announce his presence. People on the sidewalks turned startled as they saw the pickup truck speeding by. Theodore didn't care what they thought. All that mattered was getting to the hospital. He turned a corner at dangerous speed, making the tires screech on the asphalt, and the white building of the hospital appeared ahead. It was a small hospital, the only one in that rural town, but it had the basic resources for emergencies. Theodore prayed silently that it would be enough. He entered the parking lot without slowing down much and braked abruptly right in front of the emergency entrance, leaving tire marks on the ground. Even before turning off the engine, he was already jumping out. "Help, I need help here, emergency!" he shouted with all the strength of his lungs. The emergency door opened immediately, and 2 nurses rushed out, followed by a young doctor in a white coat. Theodore ran to the back door of the pickup and opened it, revealing the unconscious woman and the crying girl at her side. The nurses didn't waste time with questions, they just acted. One of them got into the pickup and began to quickly assess the patient while the other ran to get a stretcher. The doctor approached and made a quick assessment, touching the woman's forehead and checking her pulse. Theodore saw his expression change, becoming grave and concerned. The girl didn't want to let go of her mother's hand, holding on tightly, but the nurse inside the pickup spoke to her gently. The other nurse came running back with the stretcher, and within seconds they transferred the woman onto it. Theodore held the girl by the shoulders, gently pulling her away so the professionals could work. "She'll be okay, everything will be fine," he told the child, desperately wishing it to be true. The stretcher was pushed quickly into the hospital, going through the automatic doors of the emergency room. Theodore followed right behind, still holding the girl by the shoulders, guiding her inside. The emergency corridor was painted light green, with that characteristic hospital smell that mixed disinfectant and something indefinable. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, preparing the emergency room. Theodore and the girl were stopped by an older nurse at the reception. She had grey hair tied in a tight bun and a professional but compassionate look. Theodore tried to go past her to accompany the woman, but the nurse firmly held his arm. The girl started crying louder, trying to run after her mother, but Theodore held her back. He could feel her small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. "The doctors will take care of her now. You need to stay here and give me some information," said the nurse, her voice firm but gentle. Theodore turned to the nurse, his face showing all the urgency and desperation he felt. He was breathing with difficulty, still with adrenaline running through his veins. The girl clung to his shirt, hiding her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Theodore ran his hand through her hair, trying to calm her while talking to the nurse. His own hands were still shaking from the shock and the desperate race to get there. He could hear urgent voices coming from the emergency room, equipment being moved, the sound of monitors being connected. Each passing second seemed like an eternity. Theodore looked at the closed emergency door, wishing he could see through it, know what was happening with that woman. The girl clutched his shirt more tightly, and Theodore felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. "I found her unconscious on the road," he explained quickly, his voice breaking. The nurse picked up a clipboard and began taking notes rapidly, but Theodore barely knew what to answer. He didn't know these people, didn't know the woman's name, had no medical information, nothing. All he knew was that they desperately needed help. The girl continued crying, her small body shaking with sobs. Theodore knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders to get her attention. The child's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her face dirty with soil and tears. Theodore could see the absolute fear in those childish eyes, and it broke his heart even more. He tried to smile reassuringly, but he knew he wasn't being very convincing. His own concern was too great to completely hide. "Young lady, I need you to be strong now and help me, okay? What is your mother's name?" he asked softly, keeping his voice as calm as possible. The girl sniffled and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She looked at Theodore for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could trust him. Finally, with a thin and trembling voice, she answered. It was the first time Theodore had heard her speak, and the sound of that frightened little voice affected him deeply. He gently squeezed her shoulders, encouraging her to continue. The nurse approached too, kneeling beside Theodore, her expression showing genuine compassion. The girl looked from one to the other, then back to the emergency door where her mother had disappeared. More tears ran down her face, but she made a visible effort to control herself. Theodore could see the struggle happening inside her, fear fighting with the need to help her mother. Finally, she swallowed hard and spoke again. "Avery. My mum's name is Avery," she said, and then collapsed into tears again. Theodore pulled the girl into a hug, letting her cry on his shoulder while he rubbed her back. He looked at the nurse over the child's head and saw the same concern reflected in her eyes. The nurse quickly wrote down the name and asked a few more questions, her pen racing across the paper. Theodore answered what he could, but it wasn't much. He explained where he had found them, described the state the woman was in, mentioned the high fever and obvious dehydration. The nurse nodded gravely at each piece of information, already forming a preliminary clinical picture in her experienced mind. After a few minutes, she stood up and said she would take the information to the doctors. Theodore remained kneeling, holding the girl, feeling completely helpless. He was used to solving problems on the farm, taking care of animals, fixing things. But there, in that hospital corridor, there was nothing he could do but wait. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked gently, trying to distract her a little. The girl pulled away slightly from the hug and looked at Theodore with those large, frightened eyes. She wiped away more tears and sniffled again before answering. Her voice was so low that Theodore had to lean in to hear properly. Her name was beautiful, delicate, and somehow that made the situation even more moving. It was a name that deserved a happy childhood, not this nightmare of seeing her mother fighting for her life. Theodore smiled at her, a genuine smile this time, trying to convey some comfort. He could see that Ivy was exhausted, probably hadn't eaten or slept properly for days. Her clothes were in tatters, her feet were bruised and swollen inside old sandals that barely held together. Theodore felt a wave of anger at whoever was responsible for putting that child and her mother in such a terrible situation. "Ivy, my name is Ivy," she answered, her voice breaking on the last syllable. Theodore held Ivy's small hand and guided her to the waiting room chairs. They were made of hard, uncomfortable plastic, but it was better than standing. Ivy sat next to him, but couldn't stay still. She fidgeted constantly, looking at the emergency door every second, expecting to see her mother come out. But the door remained closed, and the only things coming from there were muffled sounds of urgent voices and medical equipment. Theodore didn't know what to say to comfort her. He was not good with children, never had children of his own, and felt completely lost trying to deal with that girl's despair. But he couldn't simply leave her alone. Something inside him refused to abandon them now. He had gotten involved the moment he saw them on the road, and now he was committed to helping in whatever way necessary. "How long have you been traveling, Ivy?" he asked, trying to better understand the situation. Ivy took a while to respond, as if she were counting the days in her mind. Her eyes became distant for a moment, probably recalling the difficult journey they had made. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with exhaustion and sadness. The story she told was heartbreaking. Theodore listened in silence, feeling anger and indignation grow inside him with each detail. Ivy explained that they had lost everything, that they were looking for work, that her mother had given all the food to her during the walk. The girl seemed to carry a weight on her shoulders much greater than any 8-year-old child should carry. Theodore squeezed her hand more tightly, trying to convey support and security. He wanted to say that everything would be fine, but the words seemed empty in the face of that cruel reality. 5 days. We had been walking for 5 days, said Ivy, and new tears began to stream down her face. Before Theodore could respond, the emergency room door opened and the young doctor who had attended to Avery came out. He removed his disposable gloves as he walked toward them, his expression professional, but Theodore could see the concern in his eyes. Ivy jumped from her chair immediately and ran to the doctor, clutching his white coat. The doctor placed his hand on her shoulder gently, but looked at Theodore as he spoke, as if he needed an adult to understand the gravity of the situation. Theodore also stood up and approached, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel cold sweat running down his back, anxiety tightening his stomach. The doctor seemed to be carefully choosing his words, and that made Theodore even more nervous. He knew that kind of pause, that expression doctors made when they had bad news to deliver. "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" Ivy asked desperately, her voice high with fear. The doctor knelt down to Ivy's height, but continued directing his words to Theodore as well. His face showed the seriousness of the situation while he carefully chose his words. Theodore held his breath, preparing himself for what was to come. Ivy gripped the doctor's coat more tightly, her wide eyes fixed on his face, desperately looking for good news. The hallway around them seemed to have fallen into absolute silence, as if the entire world was waiting for those words. The doctor took a deep breath before speaking, and Theodore realized that he was genuinely concerned. It wasn't just a professional posture. His voice came out calm but firm, carrying contained urgency. "Your mother is in very serious condition. We're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but her body is very weakened," said the doctor, looking directly at Ivy with compassion. Ivy began to cry again, louder this time, a sound of pure despair that echoed through the corridor. Theodore pulled her close to him, hugging her as she cried. He looked at the doctor over the girl's head, searching for some sign of hope, some indication that Avery would survive. The doctor held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, and Theodore felt his stomach sink. That wasn't a good sign. The doctor stood up and made a discreet nod to Theodore, indicating that he needed to speak with him privately. Theodore hesitated, not wanting to leave the girl alone, but she had sat down again in the chair, bent over herself, crying. A nurse quickly approached and sat beside her, putting an arm around her small shoulders. Theodore followed the doctor to the other side of the waiting room, each step weighing like lead. His heart was racing, hands sweating, mentally preparing himself for whatever the doctor was going to say. "I need to be frank with you, sir. The situation is critical," the doctor began, his voice low and serious. Theodore nodded, indicating he was listening, although every fiber of his being screamed that he didn't want to hear what came next. The doctor crossed his arms, a defensive posture that indicated the discomfort he felt giving this news. He looked directly into Theodore's eyes, maintaining eye contact as he explained the gravity of the situation. His words came out measured, professional, but laden with genuine concern. Theodore felt each word like a stone dropping into his stomach. The reality of what was happening began to solidify in his mind, heavy and frightening. He clenched his fists, trying to stay strong, trying to process everything he was hearing. The doctor continued speaking, his voice never wavering, but his eyes showing the full seriousness of the situation. "Avery has a severe generalized infection. The dehydration caused serious damage to her kidneys and liver. Her body is collapsing, trying to recover, but it's too weak to respond adequately to treatment," explained the doctor, pausing before continuing. Theodore ran his hand over his face, feeling the fatigue and stress of the entire situation beginning to weigh on him. He looked again at Ivy, who continued crying in the nurse's arms. That child didn't deserve to go through this. No child deserved it. He turned back to the doctor, trying to keep his voice steady, although he felt he could crumble at any moment. There was something about the whole situation that deeply affected him, stirring emotions he had buried years ago. Perhaps it was seeing that mother fighting for her life, reminding him of his own wife he couldn't save. Perhaps it was Ivy's innocence being destroyed by the world's cruelty. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that there were people suffering much more than him and that he had the capacity to help. He took a deep breath and looked firmly at the doctor. "Doctor, do everything necessary. I'll pay for everything, all treatments, all tests, whatever it takes, no matter the cost," said Theodore, his voice coming out firmer than he expected. The doctor seemed surprised by the statement, his eyebrows rising slightly. He studied Theodore's face for a moment, as if wanting to make sure he had heard correctly. Then his face softened, showing genuine gratitude. He nodded firmly and placed his hand on Theodore's shoulder in a gesture of acknowledgement. The tension in his shoulders seemed to decrease a little, knowing he would have all necessary resources available. This would make a difference, perhaps the difference between Avery's life and death. The doctor quickly explained what they would do next, his voice gaining a more hopeful tone, although still cautious. Theodore listened to everything attentively, memorizing every detail. "We'll do complete blood tests immediately, a CT scan to check for internal damage, and start dialysis if the kidneys don't respond. With adequate resources, we can give her the best possible chance," said the doctor, squeezing Theodore's shoulder before turning to return to the emergency room. Theodore stood there for a moment, processing everything he had just heard. His mind was racing, thinking of all the possibilities, all the possible scenarios. Most of them weren't good. He breathed deeply, trying to control himself, trying to be strong. Ivy needed him strong. Avery needed him strong. He couldn't fall apart now, not when they needed help the most. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, closing his eyes, making a silent prayer to whoever might be listening. When he opened his eyes again, there was a renewed determination in his gaze. He had found those two on the road for a reason, and he wasn't going to give up on them now. "She needs to survive. That girl needs her mother," he muttered to himself, as if the words could somehow influence the outcome. Theodore returned to where Ivy was sitting. The nurse had managed to calm the girl a little, and now Ivy was just sniffling softly, wiping her nose with the tissue the nurse had given her. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face marked by trails of tears. Theodore sat on the other side of Ivy, and the girl immediately moved closer to him, seeking comfort. She snuggled against his chest, and Theodore put his arm around her shoulders, letting her lean on him. The nurse smiled gently at Theodore, an expression that said he was doing the right thing, and then stood up to return to work. Before leaving, she leaned in and whispered to Theodore, her voice maternal and comforting. Theodore nodded gratefully, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders. "You're doing a very good thing. This girl needs someone right now," said the nurse quietly, lightly touching his shoulder before moving away. Theodore and Ivy sat there in silence for a long time. There was nothing to say that could improve the situation. All they could do was wait, and the waiting was torturous. The clock on the waiting room wall seemed to move in slow motion, each second an eternity. Theodore could hear the hypnotic ticking, marking time, while Avery fought for her life on the other side of that door. He looked around the waiting room, seeing other people in their own bubbles of worry and anxiety. An elderly man was dozing in a chair. A young woman was flipping through a magazine without really reading it. An entire family was gathered in a corner, talking in whispers. Each had their own story, their own drama unfolding. Ivy shifted against him, and Theodore looked down. She was looking at him with those big, frightened eyes. "Is she going to be okay, Uncle? Is my mom going to be okay?" asked Ivy in a trembling voice, looking at Theodore with eyes full of desperate hope. Theodore looked into those childlike eyes and felt his heart break. He wanted to say yes, wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that Avery would walk out of that room smiling, but he couldn't make promises he might not be able to keep. He had learned the hard way that life offered no guarantees, that sometimes the people we love are torn from us without warning, without a chance to say goodbye. But looking at Ivy, at that frightened child who had already lost so much, he couldn't tell the harsh truth. Instead, he squeezed her shoulder and chose his words carefully. He needed to give hope without creating false expectations, needed to be honest but gentle. His voice came out soft, laden with all the compassion he felt. "The doctors are doing everything they can, Ivy. Your mother is a fighter, I can see that. And we're going to stay here, waiting and rooting for her, okay?" said Theodore, wiping away a tear that was running down the girl's face. Ivy nodded slightly, but her hands were still shaking. She curled up more against Theodore, seeking the warmth and safety he offered. Theodore could feel her small body trembling, and it broke his heart even more. He looked at the emergency room door again, wishing someone would come out with better news, with some sign of hope. But the door remained closed, and the only sounds coming from there were muffled and indistinguishable. Time seemed to have stopped completely in that waiting room. Theodore tried to think of something comforting to say, but his mind was blank. He had never been good with words, had always been more a man of action. Now sitting there unable to do anything but wait, he felt completely useless. "Uncle, I'm thirsty," mumbled Ivy, her voice weak and hoarse from crying. Theodore stood up immediately, grateful to have something concrete to do. He looked around the waiting room and saw a water fountain in the corner. He held Ivy's hand and guided her there, taking a paper cup and filling it with fresh water. Ivy drank quickly, as if she hadn't had a drink in hours, which was probably true. Theodore filled another cup and she drank that too. He realized then that the girl probably hadn't eaten in a long time either. The memory of Ivy saying that her mother had given all the food to her during their journey came back to his mind, but even so, it was likely not enough food. Theodore looked down the hallway and saw signs indicating a cafeteria on the floor below. He hesitated, not wanting to go away in case there was news about Avery, but Ivy needed to eat. "Ivy, when was the last time you ate something?" he asked gently, already suspecting the answer. Ivy lowered her eyes, looking embarrassed. She shifted her feet, looking at her old torn sandals. Theodore could see the shame mixed with hunger on her face. She was just a child, but she had already been through situations that forced her to grow up too quickly. Life had been cruel to her and her mother, and Theodore felt a growing anger at the unfair circumstances that had brought them to this point. He knelt in front of Ivy, placing his hands on her shoulders, making her look at him. His eyes were gentle and understanding without any judgment. He wanted her to know that she was safe now, that he would take care of her while Avery fought for her life. "Yesterday morning, Mommy gave me the last bread we had," said Ivy, and fresh tears began to roll down her face. Theodore felt a lump in his throat. More than 24 hours without eating, and before that probably days of inadequate nutrition. He stood up and took Ivy by the hand again, his decision made. They needed to eat, needed to keep up their strength. It would do no good if Ivy got sick too. Theodore took the girl back to the chairs and asked her to wait there for a moment. He approached the reception desk, where the same grey-haired nurse who had attended to them was working. The woman looked up when he approached, her expression showing that she understood the difficult situation they were going through. Theodore leaned over the counter, keeping his voice low so that Ivy wouldn't hear. "I need to go down to buy some food for the girl, but I don't want to leave in case there's news about her mother. Could you keep an eye on her for a few minutes?" asked Theodore, looking back at Ivy, who was sitting alone in the chairs. The nurse smiled warmly and nodded. She got up and went around the counter, walking over to Ivy. Theodore watched them as the nurse sat next to the girl and began talking softly with her. Ivy seemed to respond shyly, and Theodore felt a wave of gratitude for that kind woman. He quickly went down the stairs to the cafeteria, his steps echoing in the empty hallway. The cafeteria was small and simple, but it was open even at that late afternoon hour. Theodore bought sandwiches, juice, fruit, and some cookies. He got more than necessary, thinking he should eat something too, although his stomach was too knotted to feel hungry. He paid quickly and ran back to the emergency floor, his heart racing with fear of having missed some important news. "Thanks for waiting, Ivy. I brought food for both of us," said Theodore, placing the packages on a chair beside them. Ivy looked at the food with wide eyes, but didn't move to take anything. She seemed to be struggling with some kind of internal conflict, looking between the food and the emergency room door. Theodore immediately understood what was going through her mind. Ivy felt guilty about eating while her mother fought for her life on the other side of that door. He sat down beside her and opened one of the sandwiches, placing it in her hands. The girl held the sandwich, but didn't bring it to her mouth. Theodore opened his own sandwich and took a bite, trying to show that it was okay. He chewed without really tasting it, his stomach too tight with worry. But he needed to set an example for Ivy, needed to make her understand that she needed to eat. "Ivy, your mother would be very sad if she knew you weren't eating. She gave all the food to you because she loves you and wants you to stay strong. So please eat, for your mother," Theodore said softly, touching her shoulder. Those words seemed to touch something in Ivy. She looked at the sandwich in her hands, then slowly brought it to her mouth and took a small bite. Then another and another, and suddenly she was eating with voracious hunger, as if her body had finally realized how hungry it was. Theodore watched her eat, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. He opened the juice and handed it to her, and Ivy drank eagerly. In a few minutes the sandwich had disappeared. Theodore took the fruit and offered it to her, and Ivy ate that too. It was like watching a wilted plant being watered, slowly coming back to life. When Ivy finally finished eating, she looked a little better, with more color in her face. She wiped her mouth with a napkin and looked at Theodore gratefully. "Thank you, Uncle. I was really hungry," she said softly, seeming a little embarrassed for having eaten so much. Theodore smiled at her and gently ruffled her hair. He finished his own sandwich more slowly, forcing each bite down his tight throat. When he finished, he collected all the trash and threw it in the nearby bin. They sat back down in the chairs, and the silence enveloped them again. The waiting room was more crowded now, with several more people who had arrived with their own emergencies and concerns. Theodore looked briefly at each of them, realizing that they all carried the same look of anxiety and fear. Hospitals were places where hope and despair walked side by side. He turned his attention back to Ivy, who was looking at her hands in her lap, lost in thought. Theodore could see that she was struggling to stay strong, but she was a child carrying a very heavy burden. "Ivy, do you want to tell me a bit about you and your mother, about how you got here?" Theodore asked gently, thinking that perhaps talking would help distract her a little. Ivy was quiet for a long moment, and Theodore thought that maybe she didn't want to talk about it. But then she began to speak, her voice low and hesitant at first, but becoming firmer as she continued. Theodore listened in silence, his heart breaking with each word. Ivy told about her father, about how he had died in an accident a year ago, how the family was left with enormous debts they couldn't pay, how they lost their house because they couldn't afford the rent anymore, how her mother worked 3 different jobs at the same time, trying to survive, trying to give Ivy a decent life, how Avery finally got sick from working so much and lost her last job, how they tried to stay with relatives but weren't accepted, how they began to walk, searching for any opportunity, any place where they could start over. Dad was so good. He worked hard and always played with me when he got home. But then he had the accident and everything fell apart, Ivy said, wiping the tears that started falling again. Theodore felt anger growing inside him again. Not anger at specific people, but anger at the injustice of life, at how fate could be so cruel to innocent people. Ivy and Avery deserved none of this. They were just victims of circumstances beyond their control, struggling to survive in a world that seemed to have turned its back on them. Theodore thought about his own abandoned farm, about how he had given up after losing his wife. But at least he had a roof over his head, had food, had some security. Those two had nothing but each other, and now even that was being threatened. Theodore put his arm around Ivy again, pulling her close. He didn't have adequate words to express what he felt, so he just held the girl while she cried silently. "Your mother is a very brave woman, Ivy, and you are very brave too," said Theodore, his voice hoarse with emotion. The hours passed slowly in the waiting room. Afternoon turned into night, and the fluorescent lights of the hospital seemed to grow brighter against the darkness outside. Theodore and Ivy remained there, sitting side by side, united by fear and hope. Occasionally nurses walked down the hallway, but none of them brought news about Avery. Theodore tried asking at the reception desk a few times, but the answer was always the same. The doctors were still working, still doing everything they could. No news at the moment. That no news was both comforting and terrifying. It meant that Avery was still alive, but it also meant she was still in critical danger. Ivy began to doze off, leaning against Theodore, physically and emotionally exhausted. Theodore didn't move, letting the girl rest even if his position became uncomfortable. "Uncle, I think I'm really scared," Ivy murmured, half asleep, her voice so low that Theodore could barely hear. Theodore gently squeezed her shoulder, trying to convey comfort even without words. He looked at the emergency door one more time, and finally, after what seemed like an eternity, It opened. The same young doctor from before came out, but this time his expression was even more somber. He removed his surgical mask and cap, revealing a tired and worried face. Theodore felt his heart immediately race. He gently nudged Ivy to wake her up, and the girl opened her eyes confused for a moment before remembering where she was. When she saw the doctor, she became completely alert instantly. The two stood up at the same time and went to meet the doctor. Theodore could see in his eyes that the news wasn't good. His stomach twisted in anticipation of what was to come. "Doctor, how is she? Please say she's better," said Theodore, his voice coming out more desperate than he intended. The doctor looked at them both, and Theodore saw the hesitation in his eyes. He clearly didn't want to give that news, especially in front of a child, but there was no choice. He took a deep breath and began to speak, choosing his words carefully. Ivy grabbed Theodore's hand tightly, her small nails digging into his skin. Theodore didn't even feel it, all his attention focused on the doctor. The corridor around them seemed to have fallen into absolute silence, or perhaps it was just that Theodore couldn't hear anything beyond the doctor's voice. Each word was like a sentence, heavy and definitive. The doctor placed his hand on Ivy's shoulder, a gesture of genuine compassion before continuing. "The situation has worsened. Avery went into septic shock. The infection has spread through the bloodstream and her organs are beginning to fail," the doctor explained, his voice professional but filled with pity. Ivy let out a stifled cry, bringing her hands to her mouth. She began to shake violently, and Theodore pulled her close, holding her while looking at the doctor with eyes wide with horror. Septic shock. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to understand that it was very, very serious. It was the body going into total collapse, systems failing one after another. The doctor continued talking, explaining the technical details, but Theodore could barely process the words. All he could think about was that Avery was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ivy was crying uncontrollably now, her small body shaking with violent sobs. Theodore held her tighter, trying to be strong for her, but feeling that he himself was on the verge of collapse. "Her organs are failing one by one. We've already started aggressive support measures, but her body is very weak. The next few hours will be decisive," continued the doctor, his expression showing how serious the situation really was. Theodore closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control his own emotions. He needed to be strong, needed to maintain his composure for Ivy. But it was so difficult, so immensely difficult. He opened his eyes again and looked directly at the doctor, searching for any sign of hope, any indication that there was a chance. The doctor held his gaze, and Theodore saw compassion there, but also a brutal honesty. The doctor wasn't going to lie to them or give false hope. He was being as honest as he could be in an impossible situation. Theodore took a deep breath, trying to find his voice, trying to ask the question he was afraid to hear the answer to. Ivy raised her face from his chest, looking at the doctor with red, swollen eyes, waiting, pleading for good news. "Doctor, will she survive? Please tell me she has a chance," asked Theodore, his voice breaking on the last word. The doctor hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any word could. He looked at Ivy, then back to Theodore, clearly struggling with how honest he should be. Finally, he sighed deeply and answered, his voice soft but firm. Theodore felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Ivy began to cry even louder, a sound of pure anguish that echoed down the hallway. Other people in the waiting room looked in their direction, their expressions showing compassion. Theodore pressed Ivy against himself, feeling his own tears burning his eyes. He wasn't going to cry, not in front of Ivy. She needed him to be strong, but inside, he was falling apart. The doctor placed his hand on Theodore's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. "There is a chance, but I need you to understand that it's small. We are doing absolutely everything we can, but the situation is extremely serious. You'll need to prepare for the worst," said the doctor, and Theodore saw tears forming in his eyes too. Ivy moved away from Theodore and grabbed the doctor's coat with both hands, looking up with a heartbreaking desperation. Her face was wet with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She looked so small, so fragile, and Theodore felt a physical pain in his chest, seeing that child suffering so much. Ivy began to speak, the words tumbling out between sobs, her voice rising in desperation. She was pleading, begging, trying to make the doctor understand how much her mother meant to her, how Avery was all she had in the world, how she couldn't lose her mother too, not after already losing her father. Theodore knelt beside Ivy, placing his hand on her back, trying to calm her, but knowing that there were no words that could comfort that pain. "Please, doctor, save my mother. She's all I have. I don't have anyone else. Please, please don't let her die," cried Ivy, her voice echoing down the hallway. The doctor knelt too, getting to Ivy's level. He held her small hands, which were still clutching his coat. His face showed all the compassion he felt, but also the powerlessness in the face of a situation that was beyond his control. He was only human, limited by science and medicine, doing the best he could, but knowing that sometimes the best wasn't enough. Theodore saw the struggle happening inside him, the desire to give hope fighting with the need to be honest. The doctor took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words with extreme care. Ivy stopped screaming, waiting, her eyes fixed on his face with a desperate intensity. Theodore held his breath, waiting too, wishing for a miracle. "Ivy, I promise you that we will do absolutely everything in our power to save your mother. We have the best team working on her right now, but you need to be very brave and understand that she is very, very sick." "We will fight with all our strength, okay?" said the doctor, gently squeezing Ivy's hands. Ivy nodded frantically, clinging to that promise like a lifeline. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to control herself, trying to be brave as the doctor had asked. Theodore helped the girl to her feet, and the doctor stood up too. He looked at Theodore and made a discreet sign with his head, indicating that he needed to speak with him in private again. Theodore understood the message. There were things the doctor couldn't say in front of Ivy. He turned to the girl and asked her to wait in the chairs for a moment. Ivy hesitated, not wanting to move away, but finally obeyed. A nurse who had observed the whole scene approached and sat beside Ivy, offering comfort. Theodore followed the doctor to the same isolated corner as before. "Is there anything else we can do? Any treatment, any specialist?" Theodore said urgently, before the doctor could even speak. The doctor slowly shook his head, his expression showing appreciation for Theodore's willingness to help, but also the reality of the situation. He explained that they were already doing everything possible with the resources available at that small hospital. They had called an infectious disease specialist who was on the way. They were administering the strongest antibiotics available. They were monitoring every vital sign, ready to intervene at any moment. But the problem was that Avery's body was so weakened that it wasn't responding adequately to treatment. It was like trying to repair a house while it was collapsing, each additional organ failure making it more difficult to save the others. Theodore heard everything, feeling despair grow inside him. There had to be something more, something they could do. "Her kidneys stopped functioning completely an hour ago. We need to start dialysis immediately, but our hospital only has one machine, and it's being used on another patient who is also in critical condition. We're trying to borrow equipment from the hospital in the neighboring town, but it will take a few hours," explained the doctor, showing the complexity of the situation. Theodore ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. Hours. Avery didn't have hours. Every minute counted. He looked around as if he could magically find a solution. Then an idea came to his mind. He remembered seeing a larger hospital in the neighboring town when he passed through there a few months ago. It was farther, about an hour and a half away, but it had more resources, more specialists. Maybe they could do something that this small hospital couldn't. Theodore looked at the doctor, evaluating the possibility. But at the same time, he was afraid to suggest a change. What if Avery didn't survive the transfer? What if moving her made her condition even worse? The doctor seemed to read his thoughts because he started speaking before Theodore could ask. "I know what you're thinking. I considered the possibility of transferring her to a larger hospital, but being completely honest, I don't think she would survive the transport. Her condition is too critical," said the doctor, his voice laden with frustration at his own limitations. Theodore nodded, swallowing his disappointment. So they were stuck there, waiting for a dialysis machine that might arrive in time, might not. He looked at Ivy in the chairs, the girl still being consoled by the nurse, and felt determination grow within him. He wasn't going to give up. If Avery was fighting for her life, he would fight alongside her, would do everything in his power to ensure she had every possible chance. Theodore turned back to the doctor, his jaw clenched in determination. He would use every resource he had, would pay for everything, would move mountains if necessary. Avery wasn't going to die, not if he could help it. And Ivy wasn't going to be orphaned. Doctor, about the dialysis equipment. How much would it cost to buy one, here and now? If I buy a new one, how long would it take to arrive and be operational? Asked Theodore, his voice firm and determined. The doctor seemed shocked by the question. He blinked several times, processing what Theodore had just suggested. Buying a dialysis machine wasn't something trivial. Theodore knew he didn't have the money, but he needed to try. The doctor seemed to be mentally calculating, considering the feasibility of the idea. He scratched his head, clearly surprised but also impressed by Theodore's determination. After a moment he began to respond, his voice showing that he was taking the suggestion seriously. Theodore waited anxiously, ready to do whatever was necessary. Money was just paper, numbers in a bank account. Avery's life was infinitely more valuable. Even if we could buy one now, it would take at least 6 to 8 hours to arrive, be installed and calibrated. And we would need a specialized technician to operate it. Avery doesn't have that time. The equipment from the neighboring hospital should arrive in 2 or 3 hours. It's our best option, replied the doctor, placing his hand on Theodore's shoulder in thanks for the attempt. Theodore felt frustration burn in his chest. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, fixing things, making things happen. Even if he didn't have the money, he would find a way to help. But there, in that situation, there was nothing his money or his will could do to change the medical reality. They were at the mercy of time, biology, luck. It was a feeling of helplessness that he hated with every fiber of his being. He took a deep breath, trying to control his anger and frustration. Losing control wouldn't help anyone, especially Ivy. The doctor seemed to understand what he was feeling because he squeezed his shoulder harder before continuing to speak. There was something else in his expression, something Theodore couldn't fully decipher. It was concern mixed with determination. Theodore, I need to be completely honest with you. Even when the dialysis equipment arrives, there are no guarantees. Her condition is one of the most serious I've ever seen, but I'll fight for her as if she were my own family. You have my word, said the doctor, looking directly into Theodore's eyes. Those words brought some comfort to Theodore, knowing that Avery had dedicated people caring for her, people who truly cared. He shook the doctor's hand in a gesture of gratitude and mutual respect. The two men stood there for a moment, united by a common purpose despite being practically strangers. Then the doctor left, quickly returning to the emergency room where Avery continued fighting for her life. Theodore stood there for a few more seconds, trying to gather strength to go back and face Ivy. How was he going to explain to an 8-year-old child that her mother was on the brink of death? How could he give hope without creating illusions? He had no answers, just a silent commitment to be there, to not abandon them. It's going to be all right. It has to be all right, Theodore muttered to himself, trying to convince himself. Theodore returned to where Ivy was waiting. The girl looked at him with big, frightened eyes, searching for signs of good news on his face. Theodore tried to smile, but he knew he wasn't being very convincing. He sat down next to Ivy, and immediately she cuddled against him, seeking comfort. The nurse who had stayed with her smiled sadly at Theodore and discreetly moved away, giving them privacy. Theodore put his arm around Ivy, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had to be strong for that girl, had to give her some kind of hope to hold on to. The hallway was quieter now, the night advancing. Fewer people in the waiting room. It was as if the entire hospital was holding its breath, waiting to see if Avery would survive. "Uncle, is Mommy going to die?" asked Ivy, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. The question hit Theodore like a punch to the stomach. He looked at Ivy, at those innocent eyes full of fear, and felt tears burn his own. How to answer such a question? How to be honest without destroying a child's hope? Theodore took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He wouldn't lie to Ivy. She deserved honesty, but she also deserved hope. He gently held her face with one hand, making her look at him. His eyes met hers, and Theodore tried to convey strength and determination through that gaze. He needed Ivy to believe, because if she lost hope, he would lose it too. "Ivy, your mother is very sick, that's true, but she's fighting, and the doctors are doing everything they can to help her. As long as she's fighting, we'll continue to believe, okay? We'll be strong for her," said Theodore, wiping away a tear that ran down Ivy's face. Ivy nodded, clinging to those words like a lifeline. She curled up more against Theodore, and he hugged her tightly. The two sat there, united by fear and hope, waiting for news that seemed to never come. The hours dragged by with painful slowness. Theodore constantly looked at the clock on the wall, watching the hands move so slowly that it seemed time had almost stopped. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11. With each passing hour, Theodore felt his anxiety grow. Was no news good news? Or did no news mean the situation was so bad there was nothing to report? His mind went to dark places, imagining the worst scenarios. Ivy had fallen asleep against him, too exhausted to stay awake. Theodore was grateful for that. At least while sleeping, she had a little peace. "Hold on tight, Avery, that girl needs you," whispered Theodore to the closed emergency door. Around midnight, the emergency door finally opened again. But this time it wasn't the doctor who came out. It was an older nurse with a serious expression. He looked around the waiting room, his eyes finding Theodore's. Theodore felt his heart race immediately. Something had happened. He could feel it. The nurse began to walk in their direction, and Theodore gently nudged Ivy to wake her up. The girl opened her eyes slowly, confused, then remembered where she was and instantly became alert. The two of them stood up, meeting the nurse halfway. The man looked tired, his shoulders hunched from the weight of a long night's work. Theodore mentally prepared himself for whatever he was about to say, holding Ivy's hand tightly. "The dialysis equipment has arrived. We're installing it now and we'll start the procedure soon. But I need to warn you that the situation remains very serious," said the nurse, his voice professional but compassionate. Theodore nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. At least now they could do something to help Avery's kidneys, but the nurse's caveat made it clear that she wasn't out of danger yet. Far from it. Ivy squeezed Theodore's hand harder, her eyes fixed on the nurse as if he had all the answers in the universe. The nurse looked at the girl with pity before continuing to speak. Theodore could see that he was accustomed to delivering bad news, but that it never got easier, especially to a child. The hallway seemed to have suddenly gone cold, or perhaps it was just the chill of fear running through Theodore's body. He waited, holding his breath, preparing himself for what would come next. "The infection specialist we called is inside, evaluating her condition. He'll decide if we need to change the antibiotic protocol or add other interventions. For now, all we can do is wait and see how her body responds," explained the nurse, placing his hand on Ivy's shoulder in a comforting gesture. Ivy looked at Theodore, her eyes pleading for some interpretation, some assurance that this meant her mother would get better. Theodore desperately wanted to give that assurance, but he couldn't. He just squeezed her hand back, trying to convey support through touch. The nurse seemed about to return to the emergency room when he stopped and turned again. There was something in his expression, a hesitation that made Theodore's stomach churn. It was the expression of someone who had more to say, but didn't know if they should. Theodore knew that look, had seen it before when his wife was in the hospital. It was the look that preceded bad news. He swallowed hard, mentally preparing himself, squeezing Ivy's hand tighter. "There's something else, isn't there?" asked Theodore, his voice coming out hoarse. The nurse hesitated another moment, then nodded slowly. He looked around as if checking if anyone else was listening, then moved closer to them. His voice became lower, more serious, and Theodore had to lean in to hear properly. Ivy also moved closer, trying to catch every word. The nurse seemed to be struggling with how much he should reveal, how much was appropriate to say in front of a child. But Theodore needed to know the truth, and Ivy deserved to know too. It was her mother in there, fighting for her life. They had the right to know what was happening. The nurse took a deep breath and began to speak, his words measured but honest. "Her heart is weakening. Her blood pressure continues to drop despite all the medications we're administering. If it doesn't stabilize in the next few hours, we'll have to consider more extreme measures," said the nurse, his tone making clear how serious the situation was. Ivy let out a low moan of despair, and Theodore pulled her close, hugging her while trying to process that information. Avery's heart was failing too. Not just the kidneys, not just the infection, but now her very heart was giving up. It was like an avalanche of bad news, one after another, each worse than the last. Theodore felt a wave of despair threatening to engulf him, but he forced it down. He couldn't fall apart now, not in front of Ivy. The girl needed him to be strong, needed to believe there was still hope. But internally, Theodore began to doubt. How could anyone survive with so many organs failing at once? How could the human body, already so weak and debilitated, recover from all this? "Thank you for keeping us informed," Theodore managed to say, his voice coming out calmer than he felt. The nurse nodded and finally returned to the emergency room, leaving Theodore and Ivy alone in the hallway again. Ivy cried silently against Theodore's chest, her sobs muffled by his shirt. Theodore stroked her hair, trying to offer some comfort but feeling completely helpless. What could he do beyond being there, beyond waiting? He had never felt so useless in his entire life. On the farm he could always do something, could always act to solve a problem. But there in that hospital corridor, there was nothing his hands could fix, nothing his physical strength could change. It was a battle happening at a microscopic level, inside Avery's body, and all he could do was hope and wait. "Mommy has to survive, Uncle. She has to survive," sobbed Ivy, her voice broken with despair. Theodore couldn't answer. He just held the girl tighter. They went back to the chairs and sat down again, resuming their vigil. The waiting room was almost empty now, just them and an elderly couple in the other corner. The silence was oppressive, heavy, filled only by the low hum of the air conditioner and the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall. 1 in the morning, 2, 3. Theodore didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Each time his eyes began to close, he forced them open again. Ivy had finally fallen into real sleep, her small body surrendered to exhaustion. Theodore held her carefully, trying not to wake her. She needed to rest, needed strength for whatever lay ahead. He constantly looked at the emergency room door, waiting, always waiting. "Please, God, if you're listening, save that woman. That girl needs her," Theodore prayed silently, though he wasn't a religious man. Around 3:30 in the morning, Theodore heard a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was an alarm, loud and shrill, coming from inside the emergency room. It wasn't a constant alarm like the ones he had heard before, but intermittent, urgent, desperate. Theodore stood up immediately, waking Ivy in the process. The girl opened her eyes, confused and frightened. The alarm continued ringing, and Theodore could hear voices shouting inside the emergency room, footsteps running. His heart began to beat so fast, he thought it would burst from his chest. Ivy looked at him with absolute terror in her eyes, already knowing something was terribly wrong. The emergency door burst open, and nurses ran out, pushing an emergency cart. Theodore saw medical equipment, defibrillators, everything passing in a blur. "What's happening? What's happening to my mother?" screamed Ivy, her voice rising in panic. Theodore tried to hold Ivy, but she broke free and ran toward the emergency room door. He ran after her, catching her before she could enter. A nurse stood in front of the door, blocking their passage. Ivy screamed and cried, trying to get through, but Theodore held her firmly, though gently. He could see through the half-open door, could see the frantic movement inside. Doctors and nurses around a stretcher, the cardiac monitor showing an erratic line. It was Avery. It had to be Avery. The alarm kept ringing, that terrible sound that meant something was critically wrong. Theodore felt his own tears finally fall, no longer able to hold them back. Ivy struggled in his arms, screaming for her mother, her absolute despair echoing through the corridor. "Let me see her. Let me see my mother. Mommy, Mommy!" screamed Ivy, her voice breaking into desperate sobs. The nurse at the door spoke quickly, trying to explain the situation, but his words were too technical, too fast. Theodore tried to understand, tried to grasp something amid the panic consuming his mind. Respiratory arrest, cardiac monitor, emergency intervention. Each word was like a knife in his heart. He held Ivy, who continued screaming and crying, her small body violently trembling. Theodore could feel the girl's absolute terror, could feel his own terror mixed with hers. Inside the emergency room, he could see the doctors working frantically, quick and coordinated movements, a desperate dance between life and death. The line on the cardiac monitor had become almost flat, only small irregular spasms breaking the straight line that signified death. Theodore felt as if the entire world had stopped spinning in that moment. Ivy screamed louder and louder, her despair echoing through the empty hospital corridor. He held her tightly, preventing her from running into the emergency room, but every fiber of his being wanted to do exactly the same thing. Wanted to go in there and scream at the doctors to do something, anything. The nurse at the door had disappeared back inside, leaving Theodore alone to hold Ivy as she struggled in his arms. Through the door opening, he could see the doctors working on Avery's body, their hands moving quickly, voices shouting commands he couldn't fully understand. The alarm continued ringing, that terrible sound announcing that a life was hanging by a thread. Theodore closed his eyes for a moment, praying with all the strength he had, begging for a miracle. "Mommy, don't leave me. Please, Mommy, don't leave me," cried Ivy, her voice breaking into a desperate sob that shattered Theodore's heart into 1,000 pieces. Theodore opened his eyes and pulled Ivy closer, turning her so she could no longer see through the door. He hugged her tightly, trying to muffle her cries against his chest, not to silence her but to protect her from seeing something a child should never see. Ivy continued struggling, but with less strength now, exhaustion and shock beginning to take over her. Theodore could feel her tears soaking his shirt, could feel her small body violently trembling. He stroked her hair, whispering meaningless words, trying to calm her even knowing it was impossible. How could anyone calm down when they were losing the most important person in their life? Theodore looked at the ceiling, his own tears flowing freely now, no longer caring to hide them. He had failed. Despite all the money, despite all the will, despite everything, he had failed to save Avery. And now Ivy would be completely alone in the world. "Please, God, don't take her from us. That girl needs her mother," whispered Theodore, his voice breaking. The minutes that followed were the longest in Theodore's life. He remained there in the hallway, holding Ivy, listening to the sounds coming from the emergency room. The alarm finally stopped, and that sudden silence was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Did it mean it was over? Did it mean Avery was gone? Theodore couldn't breathe properly, his chest too tight. Ivy had gone quiet too, but not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of shock, of absolute terror, of someone who was waiting for the worst. Theodore could feel her body rigid in his arms, all muscles tense, prepared to receive the news that would change her life forever. He continued holding her, continued stroking her hair, continued whispering that he was there, that he wouldn't leave her alone, no matter what happened. But inside, he was falling apart. "She can't be gone, Uncle." "She can't," murmured Ivy, her voice so low and broken it was barely audible. Then the emergency room door opened again, and the young doctor came out. His coat was wrinkled, his face was pale and sweaty, and he seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few hours. Theodore looked at him, desperately searching for some sign in his expression, some indication of what had happened in there. The doctor walked toward them slowly, and each step seemed like an eternity. Ivy lifted her face from Theodore's chest and looked at the doctor, her red and swollen eyes fixed on him. Theodore could feel his own heart beating so hard it seemed it would explode. The doctor stopped in front of them, and Theodore saw that he was trembling slightly. The man took several deep breaths before speaking, and Theodore prepared himself mentally to hear the most difficult words of his life. The doctor looked directly at Ivy, then at Theodore, and finally began to speak. His voice came out hoarse, tired, but there was something in it that Theodore couldn't identify yet. "We managed to revive her. Her heart is beating again." "She's alive," said the doctor, and then his legs seemed to give way, causing him to lean against the wall. Theodore was completely paralyzed for a moment, unable to process what he had just heard. Alive. Avery was alive. The relief that flooded his body was so intense he almost fell. His legs went weak, his vision blurred for a moment. He had to hold onto the wall to keep from collapsing right there. Ivy let out a cry, but this time it wasn't of despair. It was of pure joy and relief. She tried to run to the emergency room door, but Theodore held her again, more gently this time. The doctor raised his hand, asking them to wait, that there was more to say. Theodore forced himself to concentrate, to listen, even though his mind was still spinning with the news. Avery was alive. They had made it. For now, at least, they had made it. Theodore looked at the doctor, waiting for the rest of the information, knowing it couldn't be that simple. It never was. But she's in a coma. Her body has completely shut down as a form of protection. We don't know when or if she will wake up, the doctor continued, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his coat. The relief Theodore had felt was replaced by a heavy concern. Coma. He knew enough to understand this was serious, very serious. People could stay in comas for days, weeks, months. Some never woke up. He looked at Ivy, seeing confusion and fear return to her face. The girl didn't fully understand what it meant, but she knew it wasn't good. Theodore knelt in front of her, holding her shoulders, trying to find the right words to explain. But how do you explain something like this to a child? How do you say that her mother was technically alive, but also wasn't really there? The doctor approached too, kneeling on the other side of Ivy. He looked exhausted, but also determined to make the girl understand in the gentlest way possible. Theodore was grateful for his presence, for the way he treated Ivy with such respect and compassion. Ivy, your mother is resting now. Her body is very tired from fighting, so it decided to sleep for a while to recover, explained the doctor, choosing his words carefully. Ivy looked from the doctor to Theodore, her big eyes searching for confirmation, for more detailed explanation. Theodore nodded, trying to show that what the doctor was saying was true, even if it was an oversimplified truth. He could see the girl's mind working, trying to process that information, trying to understand what it meant for her and her mother. Tears were still streaming down Ivy's face, but now they were tears of confusion and fear instead of absolute despair. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, sniffling loudly. Theodore took a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her, waiting patiently as she cleaned herself. The corridor around them had returned to silence, the drama of the emergency having passed, leaving only fatigue and uncertainty in its wake. But she will wake up, won't she? Mommy will wake up and get better, asked Ivy, her voice laden with desperate hope. The doctor hesitated, and Theodore saw the struggle happening inside him. Tell the truth or give hope. Be honest or be kind. In the end, he chose a middle path, as Theodore hoped he would. The doctor held Ivy's small hand, squeezing it gently. His expression was serious but not without hope. Theodore could see that he really cared, that this wasn't just another case for him. Avery had become more than a patient. Ivy had become more than just a patient's daughter. They had touched this doctor somehow, just as they had touched Theodore. It was impossible not to care, not to become emotionally involved. Theodore held Ivy's other hand, and the three of them stood there, connected by that moment of uncertainty and fragile hope. I can't promise, Ivy, but I'll tell you this. Your mother is one of the strongest women I've ever seen. The fact that she's still alive after everything she's been through is extraordinary. If anyone can wake up from this coma, it's her, said the doctor, and Theodore saw tears forming in his eyes too. Ivy nodded, clinging to those words. She wiped more tears from her face and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Theodore was impressed by this small girl's courage, 8 years old, and she had already faced more pain and loss than many adults faced in a lifetime. And yet there she was, trying to be strong, trying to believe. Theodore felt a wave of affection and protection for her. No matter what happened from here on out, he wouldn't abandon Ivy. She wouldn't be alone in the world. He would make sure of that. The doctor rose slowly, his knees cracking with the movement. He seemed to have aged significantly that night. Theodore stood up too, helping Ivy to her feet. The girl cleaned her face once more, then looked at the doctor with determination in her eyes. Can I see her? Please, let me see my mom, asked Ivy, her voice still trembling but firm. The doctor looked at Theodore, as if asking for his opinion. Theodore nodded. Ivy needed to see her mother, needed to see with her own eyes that Avery was still there, still breathing. The doctor agreed and motioned for them to follow him. He led them through the emergency door, and Theodore felt his stomach turn as he entered that environment. The smell of disinfectant was strong, mixed with other odors he preferred not to identify. There were several stretchers separated by curtains, and they followed the doctor to the last one in the row. The doctor stopped before opening the curtain, turning to Ivy once more. His expression was gentle but serious. Theodore put his hand on Ivy's shoulder, providing support. He knew that what they were about to see would be difficult, especially for a child. "Ivy, your mother has a lot of tubes and equipment connected to her. It might look scary, but they're all there to help her, okay? She's in a deep sleep and can't hear you, but you can stay close to her," explained the doctor before opening the curtain. Theodore wasn't prepared for what he saw when the curtain opened. Avery was lying on the stretcher, pale as a sheet, almost transparent. There were tubes coming out of her nose, her mouth, her arms. Monitors around you blinked and emitted low sounds, measuring each heartbeat, each forced breath. A large machine next to the bed made a rhythmic and mechanical sound, pumping air into her lungs. Another piece of equipment was connected to her by tubes that Theodore assumed to be the dialysis machine that had finally arrived. Avery looked so small, so fragile there in that bed, surrounded by all that technology keeping her alive. Theodore felt tears burn his eyes again. Ivy stood paralyzed at the entrance, her eyes wide with shock. Theodore held her by the hand, giving her strength. "It's a lot, I know. But all this is keeping her alive, helping her recover," Theodore said softly, kneeling beside Ivy. Ivy took a few hesitant steps toward the stretcher, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. When she reached the side of the bed, she extended her trembling hand, gently touching Avery's arm. The skin was cold, and Ivy quickly pulled her hand back, startled. Theodore approached as well, standing on the other side of the bed. He looked at Avery's face, studying her features calmly for the first time. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with brown hair spread across the pillow. Even in a coma, even so sick, he could see that she had been beautiful. But more than that, he could see strength in her face, determination even in unconsciousness. The doctor was right, she was a fighter. She had to be to have survived all that. "She's so quiet." "Mom is never quiet. She's always doing something, always talking to me," said Ivy, her voice breaking again. Theodore went around the bed and placed his hand on Ivy's shoulder. He looked at the doctor, who was checking the monitors, making fine adjustments to the equipment. The man worked with practiced efficiency, but Theodore could see the fatigue in every movement. How many hours had he been on duty? How many times that night had he fought against death and won? Theodore felt a deep gratitude for that doctor, for the entire team that had saved Avery. He would make sure to thank them properly when this was all over, if this all ended well. The doctor finished his checks and approached them again. He placed his hand on Ivy's head, a paternal gesture that made Theodore's eyes burn again. "Ivy, you can stay here with her for a few minutes, but then you need to rest." "I'll arrange a room where you can stay," said the doctor, looking at Theodore as he said the last part. Theodore nodded gratefully. He hadn't thought about it, but of course they couldn't spend the entire night in those uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, especially not knowing they could be there for days, perhaps weeks. The doctor left, leaving them alone with Avery. Ivy moved closer to her mother, looking at her face with intense attention. Theodore watched the girl study every detail of her mother's face, as if trying to memorize every line, every feature. He understood that impulse, that need to preserve the image in case it was the last time, but he refused to think that way. Avery was going to wake up. She had to wake up. Ivy leaned in and gently kissed her mother's forehead, being careful not to disturb any tubes. "Mom, I'm here. Uncle Theodore is taking care of us. You just need to rest and get better, okay?" "I love you so much," whispered Ivy, her voice so low that Theodore could barely hear. Theodore had to turn away for a moment, wiping away his own tears. That scene was too much for his heart. He had never considered himself a particularly emotional person, but these last few hours had destroyed all his defenses. He had become involved with these two strangers in a way he didn't fully understand, but also didn't question. Some things just happened, some connections just formed, no matter how unlikely. He had found Avery and Ivy for a reason. He had to believe that. It couldn't just be coincidence. When he turned back, Ivy was caressing her mother's hand, talking softly to her about everyday things, as if Avery could hear. Perhaps she could, Theodore thought. He had heard stories of people in comas who could hear what was happening around them. "When you wake up, Uncle Theodore promised that he'll help us. We won't be alone again, Mom," said Ivy, and Theodore felt a weight settle in his chest. He didn't remember making that promise explicitly, but he also knew he didn't need to. It was obvious, implicit in every action he had taken since finding them. He was going to help them, take care of them, ensure they had a safe place to stay. Especially now, knowing their story, knowing they had no one else. How could he do differently? How could he simply abandon them after all this? The doctor returned a few minutes later with a nurse. They explained that there was a room available upstairs, normally used for family members of patients in critical condition. It had 2 small beds, a bathroom, and was more comfortable than the waiting room chairs. Theodore thanked them profusely. The nurse smiled gently and gestured for them to follow her. Ivy hesitated, not wanting to leave her mother. "Can I come back early tomorrow? Can I stay with her?" asked Ivy, looking from the doctor to the nurse with pleading eyes. The doctor knelt in front of her once more, and Theodore noticed that he had done this several times that night. He was a good man, a doctor who truly cared about his patients and their families. Theodore made a mental note to find out his name later, to write a thank you letter to the hospital. The doctor held Ivy's hands, looking directly into her eyes. His expression was gentle but firm, the expression of someone who knew that sometimes being kind meant setting necessary boundaries. Theodore could see that he was trying to balance Ivy's emotional need to be near her mother with the practical need for the girl to rest and take care of herself. It was a thin line to walk. "You can visit your mother several times a day, as many times as you want, but now you need to rest. Your mother will need you to be strong when she wakes up, so you need to take care of yourself too. All right?" said the doctor, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ivy nodded reluctantly. She turned to her mother once more, gave her one last kiss on the forehead, and whispered a few more words that Theodore couldn't hear. Then she stepped away from the bed, and Theodore saw the willpower that required from her. They followed the nurse out of the emergency room, up a flight of stairs to a quieter corridor. The room the nurse showed them was simple but clean and reasonably comfortable. There were 2 narrow beds, a small sofa, an old television hanging on the wall, and a tiny bathroom. Theodore thought it was a palace compared to the chairs in the waiting room. The nurse told them there was a cafeteria on the ground floor that opened at 6 in the morning, and that they could return to the emergency room whenever they wanted during visiting hours. Then she left, gently closing the door behind her. "Uncle, I can't sleep. What if Mom needs me and I'm not there?" said Ivy, sitting on one of the beds but clearly still tense and worried. Theodore sat on the other bed, facing Ivy. He was exhausted. Every bone in his body ached, but he knew Ivy needed him awake a little longer. She needed to talk, needed to process everything that had happened. Theodore wasn't good with words, never was, but he would do his best. He took off his shoes and leaned back against the headboard of the bed, motioning for Ivy to do the same. The girl obeyed, removing her old sandals and snuggling under the thin blanket. She looked at him with those big eyes, waiting for him to say something that would make everything make sense, something that would take away the fear. But Theodore had no magic words. All he had was honesty and his presence. "Ivy, the doctors will take very good care of your mother. If there's any change, anything at all, they'll call us immediately. But now you need to get some sleep. Your body needs to rest," said Theodore, trying to make his voice sound comforting. Ivy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. Theodore could see the battle happening inside her, fear fighting against exhaustion. Finally, exhaustion began to win. Her eyes started to get heavy, blinking more slowly. Theodore watched her, waiting for her to finally fall asleep. It took almost an hour, but eventually Ivy succumbed to tiredness, her body finally relaxing, her breathing becoming deep and regular. Theodore sighed with relief. The girl desperately needed that rest. He got up silently and pulled the blanket over her, making sure she was well covered. Then he returned to his own bed, but didn't lie down. He couldn't sleep, not with everything going through his mind. He sat there in the dark, looking through the small window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first sign of dawn. Another day was beginning, and Theodore didn't know what it would bring. "Hang in there, Avery. That girl needs you," he whispered in the dark. The days that followed merged into a strange and exhausting routine. Theodore and Ivy woke up early, had breakfast in the hospital cafeteria, and then spent the entire day in the emergency room beside Avery. The doctors had moved Avery to a more private room, a small mercy that Theodore was immensely grateful for. There, at least, Ivy could stay beside her mother without the constant coming and going of the main emergency area. Theodore had returned to the farm only once, quickly, to get clean clothes for himself and buy new clothes for Ivy. He had also brought some children's books he found in a store, thinking that Ivy could read to her mother. The days were long and difficult. Ivy spent hours sitting next to Avery's bed, holding her hand, talking to her, telling stories, singing songs they used to sing together. Theodore stayed there too, sometimes reading the newspaper aloud, sometimes just sitting in silence, a constant presence. "Mom, remember that time we made cookies and burned them all? We laughed so much," Ivy would say, her voice firm but melancholic. Avery didn't respond, of course. She remained motionless, her face serene but empty. The only sounds were the constant beeping of the monitors and the mechanical whisper of the breathing machine. It was frustrating and frightening at the same time. Each day that passed without change was a day of hope, dying a little more. Theodore could see it in the doctor's eyes, in the way they checked on Avery and then left, subtly shaking their heads. They were beginning to lose hope. On the third day, the young doctor who had been caring for Avery since the beginning called Theodore for a private conversation. They stood in the hallway, far enough so that Ivy couldn't hear. The doctor looked even more tired than before, probably because he was following Avery's case closely, checking on her several times a day, even when he wasn't officially on duty. Theodore appreciated that dedication, but also feared what the doctor was going to say. "Theodore, we need to talk about realistic expectations here. Avery has been in a coma for 3 days. The longer it goes on, the lower the chances of recovery," the doctor began, his voice low and careful. Theodore felt his stomach sink. He knew what was coming, could feel the direction that conversation was taking. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. There was something inside him, an intuition, a feeling he couldn't explain, telling him that Avery would wake up. It was irrational, it was just desperate hope, but he clung to it. He looked through the window of the room where Ivy was sitting beside her mother, reading a book aloud. That girl's dedication, her unwavering faith that her mother would wake up, was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Theodore turned back to the doctor, his jaw tight with determination. He wouldn't let them tell Ivy it was time to give up, wouldn't let them take that hope away from her. "Doctor, I understand what you're saying. But something tells me Avery will wake up. Don't ask me how I know, I just know. Please don't give up on her yet," said Theodore, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. The doctor studied Theodore's face for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled slightly. It wasn't a happy smile, but a smile of understanding, of respect. He put his hand on Theodore's shoulder and nodded. There was something changing in his expression, as if Theodore's determination had rekindled something inside him too. Perhaps he also needed that hope, that reminder of why he had become a doctor in the first place. To fight, to never give up as long as there was a chance, however small. Theodore felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They weren't going to give up on Avery, not yet. They would continue fighting, continue hoping. For Ivy, for Avery, for all of them. "All right, we'll keep fighting. But you need to understand that there may come a time when we'll have to make difficult decisions. I hope it doesn't come to that, but you need to be prepared," said the doctor, squeezing Theodore's shoulder before returning to his rounds. Theodore stood there in the hallway for a few more minutes, processing the conversation. Difficult decisions. He knew what that meant, turning off the machines, letting Avery go. But he refused to think about that now. There was still time, still hope. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders and went back to the room where Ivy was waiting. The girl looked up when he entered, her eyes searching for signs of bad news on his face. Theodore smiled, trying to appear confident and positive. He sat in the chair on the other side of Avery's bed and picked up one of the books. Ivy had read enough for today. It was his turn to read for a while. While reading, Theodore occasionally looked at Avery's face, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that she was listening, that she was coming back to them. "And the princess finally found her way back home," Theodore read, his voice filling the silent room. The night of the third day was especially difficult. Ivy had had a nightmare and woken up screaming, calling for her mother. Theodore had to hold her for almost an hour before she calmed down enough to go back to sleep. He had stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the chair between the two beds, silent guardian of Ivy while she slept. When the sun began to rise on the fourth day, Theodore felt a deep fatigue in his bones. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, but emotional too. The whole situation was taking its toll. He looked at Ivy, still sleeping deeply after the nightmare, and then decided to let her rest a bit longer. He went down alone to Avery's room, wanting to check on her before waking Ivy. The hallway was silent, only the sound of his footsteps echoing. He entered the room and approached the bed, looking at Avery's serene face. "You need to wake up. Ivy needs you." "I know you're fighting, but you need to come back now," Theodore whispered, feeling a little foolish for talking to someone in a coma. That's when he saw it, or thought he saw it. It was so subtle, so small, that he thought he had imagined it. But then it happened again. Avery's fingers twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly. Theodore froze, watching, waiting, holding his breath. Could it be? Or was it just an involuntary reflex? He had seen her fingers move before occasionally. The doctors had explained they were just muscle spasms, nothing significant. But something about that movement seemed different. Theodore leaned in closer, watching Avery's face with intense attention, and then he saw it again, this time more clearly. Her eyelids fluttered. Theodore felt his heart race. He pressed the call button for the nurse repeatedly, not taking his eyes off Avery. "Avery? Avery, can you hear me? If you can, try to move your fingers again," said Theodore, his voice urgent but gentle. And she did. Avery's fingers contracted again, more definitely this time. Theodore let out a choked exclamation. She was responding. Avery was responding to stimuli. The door opened and a nurse entered quickly, alarmed by the urgent calls. Theodore pointed to Avery, stumbling over words as he tried to explain what he had seen. The nurse approached quickly, checking the monitors, checking Avery's pupils with a small flashlight. She then ran out, calling for a doctor. In seconds, the room was full of medical professionals. Theodore was gently pushed to the corner, watching as they worked, checking Avery from all angles. The young doctor arrived running, still adjusting his coat. He leaned over Avery, calling her name, asking her to open her eyes if she could hear him. Theodore held his breath, praying, begging. "Avery, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand," said the doctor, placing his hand in hers. And then, as if it were the greatest miracle Theodore had ever witnessed, Avery squeezed the doctor's hand. Lightly, weakly, but definitely. The room exploded in controlled activity. The doctors began procedures that Theodore didn't understand, talking quickly among themselves in medical terms. But through all this, Theodore could see the excitement, the positive shock on their faces. Avery was waking up, really waking up. Theodore felt tears streaming down his face without shame. He needed to tell Ivy. He ran out of the room, taking the stairs two at a time, his heart beating erratically. He entered the room where Ivy still slept, and woke her gently but urgently. Ivy opened her eyes confused, then frightened, thinking something bad had happened. "Ivy, your mother is waking up. She's responding. She's moving. Come quickly," said Theodore, helping the girl to get up. Ivy didn't need to be told twice. She jumped out of bed and ran out of the room with Theodore right behind. They flew down the stairs, Ivy shouting for her mother. When they reached the room, the doctors were still working, but moved aside to let Ivy in. The girl ran to the bedside, grabbing Avery's hand, and it was at that moment, with Ivy calling for her, that Avery finally opened her eyes. They were unfocused initially, confused, blinking against the bright light. But then they focused on Ivy, and Theodore saw recognition there. Tears began to roll from Avery's eyes. She tried to speak, but the tube in her throat prevented her. The doctor quickly explained that they were going to remove the tube, but that she needed to stay calm. Avery nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving Ivy's face. The procedure to remove the breathing tube was quick, but obviously uncomfortable. Avery coughed and gagged, but then finally was breathing on her own. Mum, you're back!" cried Ivy, her face wet with tears of joy. Avery tried to speak, her voice coming out hoarse and weak after days without use. She raised a trembling hand and touched Ivy's face, tears flowing freely. Theodore watched from the doorway, his own vision blurred by tears. It was the most beautiful moment he had ever witnessed. Mother and daughter reunited after walking so close to tragedy. The doctor checked Avery's vital signs while allowing that moment a wide smile on his face. He looked at Theodore and nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and shared celebration. Avery tried to speak again and this time managed to form words even if weak. "Ivy, my love, I'm here," whispered Avery, her voice breaking. The following days were of slow but steady recovery. Avery was still very weak, her body still struggling to recover from everything it had been through. But she was conscious, she was present, and that made all the difference. Ivy wouldn't leave her side, and the doctors had given up trying to make the girl leave the room for more than a few hours at a time. Theodore remained there too, now an unofficial member of that small family. He provided everything they needed, food, clothes, small comforts. Avery had tried to thank him several times, but Theodore always deflected, saying it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. Most people would have driven right past them on that road. Avery improved a little each day. The doctors were calling her recovery miraculous, considering how close to death she had been. It's rare to see someone come back from such a critical state. Her body simply refused to give up, the doctor had said, shaking his head in admiration. 2 weeks after that first day on the road, Avery finally received medical clearance. She was still weak, still needed constant monitoring and medication, but was well enough to leave the hospital. That was when the reality of the situation really hit everyone. Avery had nowhere to go. No home, no money, nothing but the old backpack with a few rags that Theodore had kept for her. She was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, wearing simple clothes that Theodore had bought, holding Ivy's hand, looking lost and scared. Theodore entered the room at that moment, seeing her expression and knew what he needed to do. It wasn't even a conscious decision. It was simply the right thing to do. He approached and sat in the chair beside the bed. "Avery, you and Ivy will stay with me at the farm until you recover completely. Don't worry about anything. Just focus on getting strong," said Theodore, his voice leaving no room for argument. Avery looked at him, tears filling her eyes once again. She opened her mouth to protest, to say they couldn't accept, that they had imposed too much already. But Theodore raised his hand, stopping her. He looked at Ivy, who was watching the conversation with hope in her eyes, then back to Avery. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he felt but didn't know how to express, about how finding them had changed something inside him, had given him a purpose he hadn't had in years, about how he couldn't just let them go now, not after everything. But Theodore wasn't good with words, so he just repeated his offer, more firmly this time. Avery finally nodded, unable to speak, just accepting the kindness being offered. "Thank you is not enough, Theodore. You saved our lives. I'll never be able to thank you enough," said Avery, her voice weak but full of emotion. An hour later, Theodore was driving his truck down the same dirt road where he had found Avery and Ivy weeks ago. But now Avery was in the passenger seat, still weak but awake, and Ivy was in the back seat talking animatedly about everything she saw through the window. Theodore drove slower this time, without the desperate urgency of that first trip. He looked occasionally at Avery, checking if she was all right, if she wasn't too tired. She was looking out the window, watching the rural landscape pass by. When they started approaching the farm, Theodore felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He hadn't said anything about the state of the place, about how he had let everything deteriorate. Avery was going to see, was going to know how much he had given up on everything. The farm appeared at the bend, and Theodore slowed down even more. He could see Avery's expression changing as she absorbed the sight. "This is your farm?" asked Avery, her voice neutral but clearly surprised. Theodore nodded, feeling shame tightening his throat. The farm that had once been his pride and joy was now in ruins. The fences were broken in several places, weeds had grown tall and uncontrolled, the main house desperately needed paint and repairs. The old barn was standing but clearly neglected, with loose boards and the roof partially missing shingles. There was old equipment rusting in the yard, and the overall impression was one of complete abandonment. Theodore parked the truck in front of the house and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. Ivy was looking around with wide eyes but said nothing. Avery was looking at the house, at the farm, processing everything. Theodore finally forced himself to speak. his voice coming out rough and embarrassed. "It's not in good condition. I kind of gave up on everything a few years ago. After my wife died, I simply didn't see the point in continuing." "But the house has enough rooms and at least it's a roof over your heads," said Theodore, unable to look at Avery as he spoke. Avery remained quiet for a long moment, still looking through the truck window at the abandoned farm. Theodore mentally prepared himself for the disappointment that would certainly come, for the regret of having agreed to come to this ruined place. But when Avery finally turned to look at him, there was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet determination that surprised him. Ivy had gotten out of the truck and was already exploring the yard with the natural curiosity of a child, touching the overgrown plants, looking at the wild chickens that had nested near the barn. Theodore watched the girl, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on by bringing them to this place. Avery placed her hand on his arm, making him look at her again. There was something in her expression that he couldn't fully decipher, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something like hope. "Theodore, I need to ask you something. I know you're offering us your house, but Ivy and I would like to sleep in the barn," said Avery, her voice firm despite the weakness still visible in her body. Theodore blinked, completely surprised by the statement. He looked at the old and neglected barn, with its loose boards and abandoned appearance, then back at Avery as if she had gone mad. The idea of putting a woman who had just left the hospital and a small child to sleep in that place seemed absurd, almost offensive. He immediately shook his head, his expression showing total disapproval of the idea. The barn barely had a door that closed properly, was probably full of cold drafts, and God knows what kind of animals had made it their home in recent years. Theodore couldn't allow that, not after everything they had been through, not when he had a perfectly good house with plenty of spare rooms. Avery seemed to have anticipated his reaction because she held his arm tighter, her eyes begging him to listen before refusing. "No, Avery, this is ridiculous. You just got out of the hospital, you're still recovering. You'll stay in the house in the guest rooms. The barn is in terrible condition," said Theodore, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Avery didn't back down at his tone. Instead, she straightened up as much as her weakness allowed, and Theodore saw a flash of the strength that had kept her alive during those terrible weeks on the roads. It was the same determination that had made her give all her food to Ivy, the same willpower that had brought her back from the coma. She looked directly into his eyes without blinking, and Theodore felt he was losing that battle before it even began. Ivy had stopped exploring and was watching the conversation from a distance, clearly curious about what was happening. Avery took a deep breath before continuing, choosing her words carefully. Theodore could see that this was important to her, very important, but he couldn't understand why. The barn was a terrible place compared to the comfortable rooms in the house. "Theodore, you've already done so much for us. You saved my life, paid all the hospital bills, bought clothes and food for us. I can't just walk into your house and take over your space. I need to maintain some dignity. The barn will serve perfectly fine, I promise," explained Avery, her voice laden with emotion, but also with pride. Theodore finally began to understand. It wasn't about comfort or practicality. It was about pride, about dignity. Avery didn't want to be a charity case, didn't want to be seen as someone who simply received without giving anything in return. She wanted to maintain some control over her situation, some independence even in the midst of that disaster her life had become. Theodore sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair in frustration. He understood that feeling, would probably feel the same if he were in her position, but that didn't make the idea any less absurd. The barn needed serious repairs before anyone could consider sleeping there. But looking at Avery's face, seeing the determination mixed with pleading in her eyes, Theodore knew he was fighting a losing battle. She had decided, and nothing he said would change her mind. Ivy had approached and was now standing beside her mother, looking at Theodore with those big eyes waiting for his answer. "Avery, at least let me clean the barn first, fix the loose boards, bring some decent mattresses." "I can't just let you sleep there the way it is," said Theodore, partially giving in. Avery smiled, and it was the first time Theodore had seen her truly smile since she woke from the coma. The smile completely transformed her face, illuminating it in a way that made Theodore realize she must have been quite beautiful before all that ordeal. She nodded in agreement, seeming relieved that he was no longer fighting the idea completely. Ivy jumped with joy, clearly excited at the prospect of sleeping in the barn as if it were a great adventure. Theodore shook his head, still finding the whole situation completely crazy, but unable to deny anything to those two after everything they had been through together. He got out of the truck and went to the back, grabbing the few things he had bought for them. Avery got out too, moving slowly, still clearly weak. Theodore watched her attentively, ready to help if she needed. "All right, you win. But give me at least a few hours to make that place minimally habitable," said Theodore, pointing to the barn with resignation. The next hours were spent in hard work. Theodore had forgotten how good it was to have a purpose, a concrete task to accomplish. He opened the barn for the first time in months and found exactly what he expected: dust, cobwebs, old equipment piled without order, and moldy hay from years ago. But there was also space, lots of space. The barn was large, built decades ago when the farm was still prosperous. Theodore began to clean, sweeping, removing cobwebs, moving old equipment to a corner. Avery insisted on helping despite her weakness, and Ivy ran from one side to the other carrying small things, excited about the task. Theodore had protested that Avery should rest, but she completely ignored him. He realized that this woman was stubborn when she wanted to be, as determined as she had been strong to survive those weeks on the roads. Together they worked throughout the entire afternoon, slowly transforming that abandoned space into something that looked more like a place where people could sleep. "Look, Uncle, I found a bird's nest up there," shouted Ivy, pointing to the ceiling beams. Theodore climbed an old ladder and checked the nest, ensuring it was empty and that the birds had long since departed. He carefully removed it and continued cleaning the beams, removing years of accumulated dirt. Avery swept the floor below, moving slowly but steadily, her determination keeping her standing despite the obvious fatigue. Theodore came down from the ladder and got some old mattresses he had stored in the house, still in reasonable condition. He brought them to the barn along with clean sheets, blankets, and pillows. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and reasonably comfortable. He also brought an old oil lamp he found, since the barn didn't have working electricity. When the sun began to set, the barn had been transformed. It was still a barn, but now it was a clean and organized barn with a comfortable corner where Avery and Ivy could sleep. "Done. It's not much, but it's the best I can do for today," said Theodore, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Avery looked around the barn with bright eyes. She approached Theodore and, to his complete surprise, hugged him. It was a brief hug, but full of genuine gratitude. Theodore was awkward. He wasn't used to physical demonstrations of affection, especially from women he barely knew, but he returned the hug briefly before pulling away, feeling his face warm up. Ivy ran and hugged his leg, and Theodore laughed uncomfortably, messing up the girl's hair. He looked at the two of them, at that small corner they had created together in the barn, and felt something strange in his chest. It was as if a small light had been lit in a place that had been dark for a long time. He carried to the barn a few more things he thought they might need: a jug of water, some cups, an extra lantern, more blankets in case the night got cold. "Thank you, Theodore, really. You have no idea how much this means to us," said Avery, her voice heavy with emotion. Theodore nodded, looking away because he didn't know how to handle such gratitude. He mumbled something about it being nothing and said he would prepare dinner for everyone. As he walked back to the house, he looked back once and saw Avery and Ivy organizing their things in the barn, talking animatedly. There was something about that scene that touched him deeply. Two people who had lost everything, finding joy in an old, dusty barn. Theodore entered the house and went to the kitchen, beginning to prepare a simple meal. He wasn't a great cook, but he knew the basics. As he stirred the pot, his mind wandered. Having Avery and Ivy on the farm changed everything, brought life back to the place, brought purpose, but at the same time, he felt growing pressure. How was he going to take care of them properly when he could barely take care of himself? They deserve better than a failed farmer with a farm in ruins, he muttered to himself, stirring the food more forcefully than necessary. An hour later, the three were sitting at the kitchen table in the house, eating together. It was strange for Theodore to have company after being alone for so long. The house had been silent for years, just him and his dark thoughts. Now there were conversations, Ivy's laughter, Avery's gentle voice asking questions about the farm. Theodore answered briefly, not used to talking so much, but enjoying the company nonetheless. Avery ate slowly, clearly still recovering, but she smiled as she listened to Ivy tell animated stories about the day. After dinner, Theodore accompanied them back to the barn, carrying a lit lantern to illuminate the path. Night had fallen completely, and the sky was full of stars. Ivy looked up, amazed, saying she had never seen so many stars. Theodore explained that in the countryside, away from the city lights, the stars were always like this, bright and countless. "Mom, look, that one is shining brighter," exclaimed Ivy, pointing to what was probably a planet. Theodore left them in the barn with the lantern and some more candles, ensuring everything was safe before retreating. Avery thanked him again at the door, and Theodore nodded, feeling strange leaving them there. Part of him still thought he should insist they stay in the house, but he respected Avery's need to maintain her independence. He walked back to the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The house seemed even emptier now, knowing there were people on the property but not inside it. Theodore went to his room, but took a long time to fall asleep. He lay in the dark, looking at the ceiling, thinking about how his life had changed so drastically in such a short time. Weeks ago, he was completely alone, simply existing day after day without purpose. Now there were two people depending on him, trusting him. "I hope I don't disappoint them," he whispered in the dark, finally closing his eyes. In the barn, Avery was also awake, lying on the mattress next to Ivy, who was already sleeping deeply. The girl had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the long and exciting day. But Avery couldn't rest. Her mind was racing, thinking, planning. She looked around the barn in the dim light of the lantern, seeing not what it was but what it could be. She had noticed things during the cleaning, things Theodore probably didn't even notice anymore. Old but still usable tools, wood stacked in a corner, farm equipment that just needed a little care. And more importantly, she had seen the land out there, fertile and full of potential despite being abandoned. Avery had grown up on a farm before marrying and moving to the city. She knew the work, understood the potential, and now, lying there in the dark, a plan began to form in her mind. "Theodore saved our lives. Now I'm going to save his," she whispered to herself, an iron determination in her voice. Avery rose carefully, taking care not to wake Ivy. She walked through the barn in the dim light, examining everything more closely. There was an old chicken coop attached to the back of the barn, completely abandoned but structurally sound. With a little work, it could easily be restored. Avery opened the door to the chicken coop and entered, using a candle to light the space. It was dirty and neglected, but she could see the potential. Nests could be built, fences could be repaired. If she could get some chickens, they could start producing eggs. Eggs could be sold, could generate income. It was a small start, but it was a start. Avery went back to where Ivy was sleeping and lay down again, but her brain kept working, planning. She had seen the bills piled on Theodore's kitchen table as they dined. He had tried to hide them, but she had seen the red envelopes, the collection notices. He's in financial trouble. The farm is at risk. But maybe, just maybe, we can help, thought Avery, feeling a purpose grow inside her. As the night progressed, Avery finally began to doze off, but even in her dreams she was planning, visualizing how they could bring that farm back to life. She dreamed of scratching chickens, of green gardens, of the barn restored and full of life again. They were impossible dreams, considering she could barely stand for more than a few hours without needing to rest. But Avery had never been someone who let impossibilities stop her. She had survived weeks on the roads, had survived an infection that should have killed her, had come back from a coma. Compared to all that, restoring a farm seemed almost easy. When she finally fell truly asleep, it was past midnight and the first rays of dawn were just a few hours away. It was a short night of sleep, but Avery had rested enough for what she planned to do. "Tomorrow begins a new life for all of us," was her last thought before falling completely asleep. Theodore woke up to the sound of roosters crowing, something he hadn't heard on the farm for years. He opened his eyes confused, disoriented for a moment. There were no roosters on the farm, he was sure of that. The last ones had died or run away long ago, but the sound was unmistakable, the characteristic crow of a rooster announcing dawn. Theodore sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, still half asleep. Then he heard other sounds, noises coming from outside. Voices, the sound of wood being hammered, movement. He jumped out of bed, quickly putting on his clothes. His heart was beating fast, a mixture of confusion and something like concern. What was happening out there? He ran to the window and looked outside, but couldn't see anything from his angle. Theodore ran out of the room, quickly down the stairs, almost stumbling in his hurry, and out the front door. "Avery! Ivy! Where are you?" he shouted, looking around. No one answered, but the sounds continued, coming from behind the barn. Theodore walked quickly in that direction, going around the large building. He could hear voices now, Avery's voice giving instructions, Ivy's laughter. But there were other voices too, voices he didn't recognize. What was happening? When Theodore finally completely rounded the barn and saw what was happening behind it, he was completely paralyzed. His legs simply stopped working, his feet fixed to the ground as if they had grown roots. His mouth opened in shock, and for a long moment he couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. Avery was there, wearing work clothes that he recognized as his wife's old clothes she must have found in the house. She had a hammer in her hand, nailing new boards to the old chicken coop. Ivy was beside her, holding nails, passing tools, when her mother asked, "Mom, is this nail good?" asked Ivy, and Avery nodded, smiling. But it wasn't just Avery and Ivy. There were other people there too. An older woman, whom Theodore recognized as his neighbor from a few properties to the south, was helping to carry wood. A man he vaguely knew from town was fixing the fence around the chicken coop. And most impressive of all, there were chickens. A dozen of them, maybe more, happily scratching around the newly renovated chicken coop. Some were already inside, exploring the new nests that had clearly been built. Theodore blinked several times, making sure he was still not sleeping, that this wasn't some strange dream. But no, it was real. Everything was real. Avery looked up and saw him standing there, and her face lit up with a smile. She put the hammer aside and walked towards him, cleaning her dirty hands on a cloth. "Good morning, Theodore. I hope you don't mind. We started a bit early," said Avery, her voice cheerful and full of energy. Theodore opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no sound came out. He looked from Avery to the chicken coop, to the chickens, to the other people working, trying to understand how all of this had happened. It had been just one night. A single night. How had she managed to organize all this in such a short time? And more importantly, why? Avery seemed to understand his confusion because she laughed softly, a pleasant sound that Theodore realized he liked hearing. She gestured to the work happening behind her, clearly proud of what they had accomplished in such a short time. The neighbor waved at Theodore from afar, smiling, and the man from town nodded politely before returning to work. Ivy ran up to Theodore and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the chicken coop. "Uncle Theodore, come see, we fixed everything, and we have chickens now," exclaimed Ivy, her voice full of enthusiasm. Theodore allowed himself to be pulled along, still in a state of shock. He approached the chicken coop and saw that it was indeed almost completely renovated. The broken boards had been replaced, new nests had been built with fresh straw, and the fence around it had been repaired and reinforced. It was impressive work, especially considering it must have been done in a matter of few hours. The chickens seemed happy, already establishing their territories, some already examining the nests as if planning to start laying eggs immediately. Theodore turned to Avery, who had followed him and Ivy, her expression still showing pride but also a certain anxiety, as if waiting for his approval. Theodore finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. He cleared his throat and tried again, gesturing to everything around them. "Avery, when did you? I don't understand. It was just one night," said Theodore, shaking his head in disbelief. Avery smiled more broadly and began to explain. She told him how she couldn't sleep, how she spent the night planning. As soon as the sun began to rise, she had woken Ivy and the two had started working, cleaning the chicken coop, assessing what needed to be done. Then Avery had walked to the neighboring property, where she met the lady who was now helping. The neighbor had been charmed by Avery and Ivy, moved by their story, and immediately offered help. She had brought some of her extra chickens, happy to find a good home for them. She had also called her nephew, the man who was fixing the fence, to help with the heavier work. Avery had promised to pay back with eggs once the chickens started producing, and the neighbor had happily accepted. "Your farm has so much potential, Theodore. I could see that even in the dark last night. It just needs a little work, a little care," explained Avery, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Theodore looked around again, seeing his farm through Avery's eyes. He had stopped seeing the potential years ago, only saw the work, the difficulty, the memory of better times that would never return. But Avery saw possibility, saw hope, saw a future. Theodore felt something move in his chest, something he hadn't felt for a long time. It was as if a locked door was beginning to open, letting in a light he had forgotten existed. He looked at Avery, really looked at her, and saw not a weak woman he had rescued, but a force of nature who was determined to repay his kindness in the only way she knew how. Ivy pulled his hand again, leading him closer to the chickens. One of them approached and curiously pecked at his shoes, making Ivy laugh. "We can start small, Theodore. Eggs, vegetables. I know how to work the land. I learned when I was a child. Ivy can help too." "Let us help save this place," said Avery, placing her hand on his arm. Theodore accepted Avery's help, and in the following months, the farm transformed completely. Avery regained her strength working alongside Theodore, and together they reactivated egg production, planted a vibrant organic garden, and restored the abandoned barn. Ivy helped tirelessly, selling eggs at school and spreading the news about the reborn farm. Avery revealed she was a trained pastry chef and proposed transforming the barn into a space for rural events. They worked day and night renovating the place and soon managed to schedule birthday parties, small weddings, and corporate events. The fame spread quickly throughout the region, and each event was better than the previous one. Theodore, who had confessed that the farm was mortgaged with a significant debt and only 3 months to pay it off, found in Avery and Ivy the strength he had lost. Together they worked tirelessly, waking before the sun and sleeping after it set. On the day of the bank payment, the three anxiously counted the money. They had enough to pay off the debt and still have a small reserve. When the manager stamped "paid" on the documents, they embraced, emotional. Outside the bank, Ivy shouted with joy, and Theodore looked at Avery with deep gratitude. The farm was saved. More than that, it was alive again. Theodore had found renewed purpose. Avery had found a home where she and Ivy could rebuild their lives, and Ivy had the stability and security every child deserves. The three had become a family, not by blood but by choice, gratitude, and mutual love. The farm that had almost died was now flourishing, a symbol of second chances and the transformative power of kindness. Now tell me in the comments where you're from, and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you right here on the screen. I'll be waiting for you there.